All right, welcome back, everybody, to another video. We're going from zero to producer in 90 days with Ableton Live. I'm your instructor, Torbjorn. Big thanks to Ableton for extending that free trial out to 90 days. So while we're all stuck at home in quarantine, we can at least stay productive and do something creative. Let's quickly review what we talked about last time. In our last video, we were using the wavetable synthesizer, learned how to make a couple sounds. We did this future bass swell type chord sound. We made like a hybrid 808 wobble bass, and then we were using the arpeggiator and the random LFO setting to make some kind of glitchy arpeggiated lead. That was really cool. I feel like we unlocked a lot of really cool stuff with the wavetable synth. Today is going to be all about bass. Bass is something that's super important, prevalent in a lot of dance music and a lot of electronic music. It even has its own subgenre, bass music, when you talk about the umbrella that is over like trap and dubstep and future bass and all of that type of stuff. So I wanted to talk about, as producers, how we can have a big and balanced sounding bass. So having bass being balanced in your song can make your song really impactful. On a big sound system, that bass can literally move your body with the music. And it's so ingrained in dance and club music now that even hearing that sound of a big 808 hit or something like that translate on small speakers can still feel impactful. So I wanted to start by looking at a couple 808 hits through a spectrum. All of the 808s are tuned to the note F. So I've got 5 different 808s here. Let's take a look at what we're seeing, how big we're seeing the bass fundamental frequency measured, and then how buzzy it sounds and how much of the extra frequencies we see up here on the top. Pretty big. I would say this is a round sounding 808. Peaking all the way up here at -19 is our F frequency, and then we get that first harmonic up there at about a C sharp, -25. Great sounding 808. Let's listen to the second one. Very, very different sounding. So the sub on that one is a little bit louder, going all the way up here to -15. And then we get this big round harmonic here. And then we were seeing a big harmonic on our first 808 is much quieter on this one. So that one's way more weighted towards the low end. Here's our third 808. Kind of similar to the first one, but just a little more distorted. You see, it's a little buzzier. We get kind of this louder harmonic up here on our, what looks like our fifth harmonic. Let's listen to the fourth one. Fourth and second one are a little similar as well. Big fundamental frequency, lots of like big punchy low end, but not as much high end. Let's compare that to the second 808 again. So yeah, pretty similar in that fundamental frequency, but our fourth 808 here, just a little bit more buzziness in that mid-range. Let's listen to the last one now. Very unique, kind of similarly hollow sounding to that second 808, but we get this way bigger spike here in that harmonic. So this is interesting. You'll probably notice that I'm kind of comparing like the sub versus what all of the other content that's on top of the sub is. And it's interesting to know that that's kind of what we're trying to balance out. If we've got different types of 808s or different type of bass sounds, we want them to be relatively similar on this fundamental frequency, like where that volume of that bass is hitting. Even sounds that are the same 808, as it pitches up or down, that frequency might not stay the same. So there's a couple things that we can do to balance that out that we'll talk about in a second. But first, I kind of want to just talk about this idea of like the bass that you can hear versus the bass that you can feel. So I've got a new EQ8 here, and I'm just going to use this filter, and I'm just going to get rid of all of our low frequencies so we can just hear what's happening on top of those basses. I'm guessing somewhere around 60 or 70 hertz. If we start cutting out everything below that, we'll probably only get the high end. So let's listen back through all of those 5 808s again real quick. And just pay attention to which ones you can still hear. I'll drag that frequency up even a little bit more. Which ones you can still perceive, and then which ones like completely disappear without that low frequency. Still hear that one. Our second one is almost completely gone. Still hear the third one. A little bit of the fourth. And not much of the fifth. So, right, the balance between the sub and the high end on our second 808, that's really going to be a problem. We're not going to be able to hear that unless we have a speaker that can play those low notes. Same with the fourth one. So there's like a couple things that we can do. A lot of people will do 2 different tracks. So I've just Command D duplicated this. We could do like 808 low and 808 high. And here on this low one, we'll just change this low cut filter to a high cut filter. Drag our frequency down here a little bit. And then now if we soloed this, we're only going to get that bass coming through, and then we're getting our high coming through on the other track. So on something like this second 808, where we were really struggling to hear those frequencies, now that we've gotten rid of the thing that's already loud enough, we could just use like a saturator, for example. We could like, I'll just put it on analog clip, and I'll just turn that drive way up. And so what's happening, because the saturator is like before the EQ, it's still using this big frequency here to push the saturator to get it distorted, but then we're just cutting out all of that low frequency stuff later. So that's maybe a little bit overkill, but you can get the idea. Now if we put the low one back in, we get the best of both worlds. You can saturate all of your high end, add lots of high frequency stuff, but keep that low sub clean in the low end. So that's really clutch. And everything below that kind of 100 hertz area is definitely more stuff that you feel if you've got like a subwoofer or big speakers in your car, or if you're listening to it on a club sound system or at a festival that has subs built into the sound system. That low frequency, that'll be enough to like move people with the music. But I'm listening on pretty small speakers here in my studio, and I can't even hear it. If you're listening on a laptop or on your phone, I'm sure you definitely can't hear it. And that's where distorting and doubling that sound can get us to that point earlier where I was talking about how even though we can't feel it as a big bass, we can still perceive it. And so it still gives us that feeling of bass when we're listening to music. In terms of different sub-levels here, we've got some going up to plus 18. We've got some not quite as loud. We've got some that are way loud. All you would have to do to fix that with a spectrum is just look at, let's say we wanted to get everything equal on this minus 18 line. And you can kind of pick the number that you want. It doesn't have to be minus 18. That's just a really common one. All you would have to do is use your spectrum to find the frequency, to find what part you need to turn up or down, and then just go here, turn your Q all the way up to 18. So it's really, really thin, and then just find that frequency. Of course, here we're at an F, which is 44 hertz, so you could just type in 44. And then how much louder or how much quieter does it need to be? All of our 808s here are on the same track, but we'll look at an example later where we've got different basses on different tracks. So let's press pause on the 808 thing for now. EQ8 is a great way to balance that stuff out, but depending on your sound, you might just have a little bit more success adding a sublayer. So especially if you're doing like long sustained bass sounds, long buzzy sounds, long respaces, sometimes it works with 808s, but not all the time, because 808s have a specific kind of drum-like characteristic to it. But I'll play you an example here of a couple different basses, and the sub-levels are all over the place on these basses, and so we're going to need to even them out. Okay, and so it just repeats, and so you can get the idea. So I've got all this stuff grouped, and I've got a spectrum on our bass track. So let's take a look at the different sub-levels. First and foremost, I feel like the volume is really balanced. I like all of the mid-range and the high end. I feel like that stuff is working really well. All right, so we've got three sounds. We've got this kind of stab at the beginning. We've got this long sustained sawtooth wave, and then we've got this kind of wobble bass at the end. The stab should be the big, impactful, loudest thing, but right now the sub on the wobble bass is a little bit too loud, and then the sub on the sustained note, as you can see, is way too quiet. So I think this is a little bit more than what we could easily fix with an EQ8 to balance out the volume of those different subs. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just put an operator on a track, and I'm going to make sure that it's a sine wave. And I'm going to just steal this MIDI and copy it over. And I'm going to add this sub layer now just with a low sine wave. That we've got the same amount of pitch bend range is set to an octave. We can go in here to our envelope and turn up the attack a little bit, maybe 25 milliseconds, just so we're not getting any clicking or popping. Double check we're set to one voice. We can even turn glide on. And I'll just overlap those notes. I'm getting just a little clicking sound, which not really a big deal, but I do want to avoid that if I can. That sounds a little bit better. All right, so this is just a sub. We can just call this sub. And we can look at that with a spectrum if we want to. Nice and loud. We can do the same thing here. We can just copy and paste the notes from our wobble. Double check. I've made these bass sounds with Serum. This one's actually only has a pitch bend range of 2. So this is a little bit extra to do on our sub channel here. But I do want it to be accurate. So we can actually right-click our pitch bend range, show automation. And then here at this part, I'm going to switch that from being 12 down to 2 so that the pitch bend stays correct. Duplicate that over to the next track. All good. If we really wanted to, we could put a little bit of saturation on our sub. When I want a really transparent saturation, I usually grab the sinoid fold. What do we say? Our frequency for our F was 44 hertz. Just mess with these color settings. These are ones that I typically like a lot. It doesn't change the sound of your bass a lot, but it adds an extra harmonic. You'll be able to see that here on the spectrum. Back to our concept of making sure that this is sounding good on small speakers. Now all we have to do is just go on our tracks that we want to not have the bass and just add a low cut filter. Probably something around 70 or 80 hertz will do. I'll just copy that over to our sustain. And then this stab we're actually going to leave alone for now. But now with this sub layer playing underneath all of these sounds, we should have a nice, clean, balanced sub that feels consistent throughout the whole track. It really comes out on that wobble. So that was just an example with a couple bass sounds that I made on the fly, but the principle applies. you can clean out all of your bass, especially if it's a long sustained sound or something that you can easily create with a single note. And adding that clean sine wave or a sine wave with a little bit of saturation underneath it will help get that bass sounding consistent and help that sub sound consistent. And just remember that if your sound disappears when you cut all of the sub out of it, that it's okay to do that duplicate dual filter trick and add a little saturation to your high frequency or mid-range bass, some people call it as well, just to make sure that that cuts through the mix and that you're not just relying on that sub. Because remember, only sub with no big sound system means that you're going to have zero bass. So those are some tricks that you can use to balance out your bass in your track. Hopefully you found those useful. Thanks again to Ableton for extending that trial so we can all make music while we're home in quarantine. Happy producing. Stay productive out there. Have fun. Make lots of beats. Peace out. I'll see you next time.